Right, I'm going to run through this lecture. So this is looking at the project cycle. So the project cycle, have you come across it before? The idea of the project cycle?
Oh yeah, we have. Yeah.
You often see job advertisements for a
Project manager.
Yeah, well, yeah.
Yeah, so you would have. So it's really it's a very straightforward idea, and it's been around for a long time. And there's different variations of the project cycle. But the classic one, or the one that really, I suppose, is within project management anyway, is the reference point is Baum's project cycle. And if you look at the arrows there, it's the reason it's called a cycle is that while there is a start, middle and end, oftentimes projects are continually moving. So obviously the first part is identification, then you move on to preparation, appraisal, negotiation, implementation, supervised evaluation, and then you can go back to identification again. So oftentimes one project, when it's finished, leads on to another project, and we'll look at different ways that you can present this cycle, but you see variations of it, and I'll show you a couple of variations in a minute. Okay. And then if you look at elements of the project, you can look at identification, preparation, appraisal. So there's different, and we'll go through each of them in.
Have you any samples though?
Okay. What we're going to be doing in this module is you're going to go through all of the phases. So I'm going to give you, if you look at the project proposal form and what you're going to be doing today, that's really project identification. Okay, so each stage has different activities associated with it, and we're going to go through each of them, Katrina. So by the end of this, you'll have gone through a full process of identification, you'll have gone through a full process of appraisal, you'll have gone through full process of project preparation. You won't have implemented a project. We'll talk about evaluation as well. So you won't have evaluated a project, but we'll do a small evaluation. But you will have, by the end of this, experience of everything. So just going through it, if you look at the initial assessment in a project, so this is where you have to understand the situation informing your goal. So the most important part of the project is the project goal. What is the project looking to achieve? And there is an assumption that you know the needs within a community or the needs within a market, if it's a business type project, that informs that goal. So oftentimes the starting place of a project can be a needs assessment, or within a community context it can be an existing project that you're running and you realise in working with a group of people that there is a more fundamental need, or there is an evolving need that you need to respond to. So I suppose the goal has to be informed by a need. And then you move on. Once you've identified your need and you're clear about your goal, then what you need to do, so a goal is telling you what the project is looking to achieve. Then the design looks at what are the things you need to do in order to achieve that goal. So what are the activities you need? What are the skills you need? What are the resources you need to be able to achieve that goal? Now, the design phase is really at this level is quite a high level. So it's where a lot of the innovation comes, because if you're looking at, just say for example, if we were looking at a project around homelessness, you could say in Thurles the goal of the project is within the next 5 years that anybody in Thurles who needs a home will have a home available to them within 10 days. And that's great, that's a fantastic goal. The real challenge is the design. What do you need to do to be able to ensure that you achieve that goal, or at least that you give it a that you put a project together that where there is a real expectation that that goal might be achieved. So that design phase is the phase where I suppose needs to be a real creative input. There really needs to be a strong knowledge of the sector. There needs to be clarity in some ways in relation to what you might expect from people, both people that you want to use or you want to support, but also other stakeholders. So the design phase is one of the most challenging, because oftentimes if you know the sector really well, you can be locked into the way things are done conventionally. So when you're sort of involved, say, in something like homelessness, for example, and if you're involved in providing a particular service to people who are homeless, then you oftentimes don't think beyond the type of service you already provide. And the reason you don't is because if you start saying, well, what I'm doing isn't really working, you leave yourself vulnerable to criticism. So oftentimes people continue doing what they're doing, but for a new project or for an emerging project, the possibility of designing something new or a different way of doing things, it's always important to be open to that. So once you've that design, then what you need to do is to be clear about what you need to do to make sure that design happens. So an example might be in terms of homelessness, you might decide that the project that you're going to have is you're going to encourage people who are living in family homes to convert some of their rooms to accommodation for homeless people. I know it sounds off the wall, but just say you decided, for older people whose families have grown up and gone away, this would be a good income source, and that you're going to organise them to. Then what you need to do is, what do we need to do in order to make that happen? What infrastructure do we need to put in place? Who do we need to work on the project? What money do we need? What's going to happen first, second, third, fourth? How long is it going to take us to implement the project? So at the end of this, you need to have a detailed project plan. And then what you need to do, so you take your detailed project plan, and then somebody needs to sit down with it and say, is this reasonable? Is it reasonable? They're going to have to appraise it. So is it reasonable what's being proposed? And when you're stuck in the project, you can imagine it's fantastically, makes perfect sense. But somebody from outside might see it differently. Or you might be overly enthusiastic, you might be overly ambitious, or you might be overly creative. Or you might be proposing something that somebody has already done, that you're not aware of, that hasn't worked. Or that somebody else is about to do. So there needs to be a process before you actually commit significant resources to the project of going over it, checking it, making sure that it works, or that it's making sure that it's as thorough as it can be, and that it's as potentially viable as it can be. And oftentimes the people who appraise these are funders. So oftentimes you take your project, and community groups don't often have a lot of money themselves. So the project appraisal process is really the fund application process. And that's not, strictly speaking, the best way to going about a project appraisal. What would be better as a community group, if you have time, is to go to somebody else and ask them to appraise your project before you go to a funder. The reason being that, just say they spot something that could be changed to make your project better, then it's better have that knowledge and make those changes before you go to the funder. But the reality is, in terms of how a lot of community-based projects happen, is the appraisal phase really is the phase where you send the project for approval for funding. Okay, and then the next phase is the implementation phase. So the implementation phase is when you've gotten your funding, you've gotten your permission to go ahead with your project, and off you go. So the implementation of a project, it might be that you're doing it yourself. So you're applying for funding for yourself to do a project. Or it might be that you're applying for funding, or that you're securing funding, however you do it, for somebody else to do the project. So you might say, okay, we're building a youth centre. Now, we're a youth organisation. We're not going to build the youth centre, but we're going to subcontract somebody else to do that. Or you might say, you could easily be working for a state agency, and you might decide that you need a project working with young people who are out of school. And you might say, well, we're never going to do that. Say if you're toothless, so then you're going to subcontract a youth work organisation or a private company to do that. So there is a sense that the implementation doesn't have to be by yourself. It can often be you giving the work to somebody else to do. But what you have to keep an eye on, whether you're implementing it or whether you're subcontracting its implementation, is you need to keep an eye throughout the implementation phase that the project is keeping true to the objectives, so that the project is actually is working according to the plan that you would have originally identified for it. And sometimes you need to be conscious that circumstances can change while you're doing a project that mean that your plan needs to change. So especially in community work, oftentimes you imagine that a particular approach might work well, but when you're doing it you might say, okay, look, we need to change that slightly, and a small change might mean the project would be more viable. Okay, and that's really what we're talking around monitoring. So monitoring is about keeping an eye on the project and tracking your progress, tracking the progress in terms of the fact that you're doing the activities, but also tracking the impact that those activities are having. They often talk about 3 phases of evaluation, or monitoring and evaluation within projects. One is they often talk about an evaluation before you do a project to get baseline data, and then halfway through and at the end. But there's whole cycles of monitoring throughout the life cycle of the project. And then I suppose that is at the end of a project, it needs to be evaluated. So monitoring is slightly different, and oftentimes if you're doing a monitoring evaluation cycle, evaluation happens at particular points in the project, maybe the start, the middle and the end. Perhaps if it's a long project, start, middle and end. But monitoring should be happening on an ongoing basis. There should be monitoring meetings on a monthly basis, just to keep an eye on things as they go along. Okay, and the last thing then, when a project is over, you've evaluated it, you need to have a process whereby you learn from what you've done in the project. So it might be that you learn that you didn't do your costings right, or you learn that certain people within your team are good at certain things and others are not good at other things, and you might learn that certain partners you work well with certain partners, other partners you don't work well with. Or you maybe learn that you need new training, or that there is maybe a particular type of project that you as an organisation are particularly well or particularly poorly equipped to deal with. So what you need to do is you need to learn those things and then make the changes in your organisation to respond to that learning. So it might be putting a training program in place, or it might be deciding as an organisation that you don't pursue particular types of contracts again in the future. So at the end of each project there needs to be an opportunity for you as an organisation to sit down and say, okay, what do we learn from that, and how do we incorporate that learning into how we work? That's the phase that is least likely to happen, because oftentimes when people finish a project and it's done, they just move on to the next project. So that's really the cycle. That's that's, I suppose, the different phases that there is in the project cycle. And that's sort of the classic project cycle model. There's another one here I have, if you can see it, it's sort of a screencast from the DFID activity cycle. And the DFID activity cycle is something similar. It's the same sort of idea. DFID is the English Overseas Aid Agency. And it looks at identification. Clearance then is the initial appraisal. There's a more detailed design and appraisal, approval. So really what clearance is saying, it's a bit like what we're going to do with it, is that it's the initial phase. Yes, that idea is good, let's run with it. Then you design it, and you appraise it. Then you approve it, implement, complete it, post-completion. So oftentimes with development projects, what can happen is that say if you start a project now and the project has a 2-year life cycle, and you're a development agency, whether it's an overseas development or even here in Ireland, and the project finishes in 2 years. So say it's a traveller education project, for want of a better, and it's a traveller education project, and you know there's only 2 years funding in it. There needs to be a phase built in whereby you either apply for additional funding to extend the project, or you hand the project over to somebody else. Because you can't just pull out and leave the whole thing collapsed. And that's oftentimes what's called a post-completion phase. It's that transition to what they call mainstreaming. So mainstreaming is where your project then becomes part of what the county council does. So you've done this really innovative project, and at the end it's worked out really well, and you hand it over to the county council and they run it. Or there's an extension of the project, or there's a decommissioning of the project. So it could be that you decide at the end of the 2 years this just didn't work, but you still can't just dump people, because there might be people involved in the project. So you might say, okay, we're going to phase out over the next couple of months. So it's a similar sort of cycle to the cycle that you'd have with that we were talking about a second ago, but it's more adopted for development projects. And then there's a very simple one, the project cycle there: identification, planning, implementation, and evaluation. So that's oftentimes, I suppose, the project cycle that you see: project identification, project planning, project implementation, project evaluation. Okay. Is that okay? Does it make sense? Yeah? Okay. So I'm just going to go through. There's one here. I should really have. I know it's probably hard to follow what I'm saying on that, but the slide that I'm on now is identification. Okay? So how in development work do you identify a project? And oftentimes, community groups identify projects from government policy. Okay, I'm actually going to stop here for a second, if that's okay.